Thank you, Chris. Thank you so much. That was a wonderful introduction. And thank you to Nikolai and all at the Clinton School for your kind welcome today. And thank you to Women's Action for New Directions, which is the great organization which helped bring me here today. And I'm delighted to be at the Clinton School. I have to say that I've been very moved to learn about this institution and to be here in Little Rock and see the library and see all that's happening here. It's actually very inspiring. Often at a federal budget research organization, if you can imagine, we're heads down, in these tens of thousands of lines of numbers, but to see the numbers alive in a community as vibrant as this is quite moving. And actually just now we were dreaming of what it would be like if the Clinton School, for example, were to take hold of the president's budget and issue the Clinton School of Public Service budget, and what a joy that might be. So we'll keep dreaming as we go forward. So here's my personal goal for today in being with you, is when March 4th comes and President Obama puts his budget before the nation and asks us as investors in that budget to move forward in an active and engaged dialogue, I'm hoping that the little step we take today and all of the good work that you've done in your own lives will make us feel like we can take hold of this blueprint of America's values and really shape it over the course of these next months so that when we get to October 1st of 2014 and the 2015 budget is before the nation, it represents your interests and mine and your families and your wider community. So to get us thinking a little bit about ourselves as investors in the nation, we had a little penny poll of sorts happening on the table where you were to pretend, in fact, that you spent simply $1 as an investor in our nation, and you were to think to yourself, okay, so if you could choose where to spend your tax dollar, where would it be? So I'm wondering if anybody wants to share as we get started where you might have apportioned. We talked about dimes, some people wanted to do nickels, some people wanted to do pennies. It really is just to get us thinking of ourselves as investors. Where would you spend your $1 of taxes, if anybody wants to share? Any brave soul? Okay. Okay. And why did you put, so this gentleman put most of his in education. Why did you put most of those 100 pennies in education?
Well, it seems like education is where we get a lot further down the road than investment.
Okay, so it's the return on investment for education. Good, getting us further down the road. Anybody else want to share where you might have put some of your nickels or dimes? Yes, sir.
Let me get a mic to you, sir.
Okay. Here's a microphone for you, sir.
There was in the current issue of the New York Review of Books a kind of model budget proposed by Mr. Sachs, and that struck me as especially strong on shifting to more emphasis on preparation for the future, including education, science, and so on. I wondered in a general way whether you thought that was a pretty good budget. Does that appeal to you?
I actually found it really compelling as well. It was looking far down the road at our future. And actually, it gets to the point, I think, that we all can hold together coming away from today is that there isn't one way forward for our nation. That the federal budget is the vehicle, I think, from my own perspective, the vehicle that can help us chart a destiny, and that there are multiple views that we'll hear both from the Obama budget, likely Congressman Ryan, the Congressional Progressive Caucus. We'll have a sea of blueprints out there, and it's our job as investors in the nation to choose the way forward that best represents our interests. You and I, through our federal income taxes and payroll taxes, we're going to generate 80% of the nation's revenue this year. And that may be actually an underestimate. It might be a little bit more than that this year. So we're major stakeholders. And the exercise you did today was about your federal income taxes. Your payroll taxes are, of course, earmarked for earned benefits. So with that, let's get started. So this is where your federal income taxes actually will go likely. It might be, a couple of cents off. It'll depend on what the president's budget tells us on March 4th. But this is right now where our nation is apportioning your federal income taxes. So about 26.5% is going to go to the military. That's an aggregated category. That's baseline Pentagon budget. That's nuclear weapons, overseas contingency operations, which is the war, overseas military bases, and foreign military aid. So that's going to get right now the lion's share of your tax dollars. Of course, healthcare gets 1/5 of our tax dollars. Again, that's money that's not going to the entirety of Medicare, and that's not Social Security, that's healthcare spending. And these are two of the major drivers of our overall budget, and clearly that's one of the reasons that there is an underlying interest, a national interest in having conversations about things like the Affordable Care Act and like the kind of trajectory that the Pentagon's on. And I just want to draw your attention all the way down toward the last several, right? So 2.1 cents, that's on every energy and every environment project, that's every national park, every bit of research and development, every tax credit right there. International affairs, that's every dollar spent on preventable measures overseas, every international aid project that's not military-based, every foreign embassy, every bit of peacekeeping, transportation at 1.4 cents. That, of course, has great impact in local communities, and, of course, science at 1 penny. So that means 1 penny of every one of your federal income taxes will go to science, that's scientific research. Okay, so when I say the federal budget, what do you think? Anybody, you can just shout them out. Big. What else? Bloated. Okay, good. What else? Complicated. Good. What is it? Complex? Yes, ma'am. What else? Anybody else? Sorry, I missed it. Sorry? Receding. In some cases, it is receding because of sequestration. Yes, and other kind of congressional measures. One more, if there's awesome potential. Right, awesome potential. So what you're sharing today in Little Rock actually is this very similar to people across the nation. In times of fairly huge congressional tumult, I hear frustrating, I hear alienating, right? When people are not feeling like we have the tools or resources to begin to take hold of this large, mammoth, nearly $4 trillion representation of our nation's values, right? Congresswoman Barbara Lee says that the budget is a moral document. It is a blueprint for everything we love in this nation, everything we want for our children and our grandchildren, everything we dream about in our cities. Okay, here's some additional answers, and one of which I already touched on. It's ours, right? We're the investors in it. We're the major stakeholders in this budget. It's a blueprint for how we're going to make the money and how we're going to spend the money, right? That's how our budgets are created. So they have to be about two things equally. If we're not talking as a nation about tax policy, for example, we're missing 50% of the conversation. And if we're not talking about the best ways to prioritize your investment, again, we're missing another 50%. And all of this is driven by ideology. And this morning at a great gathering, we were talking about the clash of ideology right now in our nation. And for me, this is a useful thing to remember, because I think that ideology, of course, can be transformed with good activism, great schools, good conversation, some information, some talk about real values. So we also, I hear also often when I'm on the road, and right now we're actually collecting at National Priorities Project people's hopes for the State of the Union coming, right? And so what I hear is that people want it the budget to be representative of our collective values. And so often at National Priorities Project, if we go to our website, we use public polling a lot to say that X percentage of Americans want this, and here are the budget blueprints we have in front of us that will deliver this or not deliver this. And what we know is that it has a profound domestic, so at our state and our city level, and international impact. Okay, so there's the Capitol. You'll forgive the drawing. So here's your investment, and it comes down to the Arkansas state budget. The most recent figure we have says that the Arkansas state budget actually was comprised of about 36% of federal investment. That means that your state budget, more than 1/3 of it here in Arkansas, was derived from federal funds. Now, a lot of that is, of course, Medicaid, which will translate into the like program in the state of Arkansas, or the Children's Health Insurance Program. Still, that's a sizable amount of money funneled through your state budget. So when your state budget runs a deficit, or when your state wants to meet a need or address an opportunity, federal funds have a critical role to play. Of course, cities and towns, cities get direct spending in the form of the community development block grants. CDBG money has been on the decline recently, even though it is one of President Obama's key programs. Also, community action agencies, those programs in our midst dealing with administering the Low-Income Home Energy Assistance Program, or LIHEAP, which keeps us warm in the winter and cool in the summer, which also helps with Section 8 grants for affordable housing, helps with child care, our schools that help with early childhood education intervention, and the like. They're coming into cities that way. Of course, business contracts are driven in some measure by federal spending. And one of the areas that's a key bit of conversation happening nationally, and so it should, is the role of the defense sector as a jobs engine, and the interest in many people across the United States to have a conversation about the way in which that works and doesn't work for our nation right now, and the kind of opportunities we may be able to seize if we look at especially investment in that sector. And there's bipartisan conversations happening right now that will have a direct impact on Arkansas and Little Rock. And then, of course, you and I, right? So again, this is the most recent data we can find, but about $5,800 per person on average comes into Little Rock in direct federal spending. So when things change in Washington, they change in Little Rock. And again, you drive that through your tax dollars. So here's the definition of insanity, right? Doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. And that's what we've been having for the last several years in Washington. Now, this is not disparaging the good women and men who serve our nation, but I think we can all agree that something has to change in Congress because, in fact, we've not been able to have a predictable, transparent, accountable federal budget process these many years. And that's, of course, where you come in. So I say that there are two real conversations to have today. One is about the federal budget and taking hold of it as ours. It's our budget. And the other is the conversation about the influence of money in politics. And I think those two conversations had together will transform our nation's democracy. So here's some evidence of insanity. So for the past 10 years, we haven't had a budget on October 1st. That's pretty amazing. So come October 1st, we've not been able to go through a budgeting process that has yielded a blueprint for the president to sign. We've only had 1 year with 12 spending bills. That means that only in 1 year has the Congress been able to, in their associated spending and or appropriations committees, been able to actually deliberate on a spending bill that's been totally, thoroughly scrubbed. And then in the past 10 years, we've had these 3 years funded entirely by these things called CRs. Does anybody know what a continuing resolution is? So several. So continuing resolutions are basically do-overs of the years past. Now, they're not evil things in and of their own nature, and often each of us, I mean, I know in my own life, I need a couple more days to get something done. So this is a mechanism by which Congress can do that. But in some years, like, for example, 2011 and 2013, we only had those. Now, that's a travesty for two major reasons. One is we've never been able to hear the full blueprint, the policies driving the president's budget come to fruition. So we're basically doing over the same year again. And the programs that the president and or the directors of the associated agencies thought were obsolete don't get sunsetted. So they continue to take resources. And the new ways forward don't get their fruition. They don't get to be tested in our midst. Those ways forward that might be better for ourselves in this country or people across the world, the globe. So that's a problem. And specifically with 2011, there was such what's the word? Foment is coming to mind, or tumult about debt and deficit, right? The nation was focused there. That in fact, over the course of 2011, tens of billions of dollars were cut from the discretionary portion of the budget in ways that you and I could not possibly begin to hang on to, let alone influence, because they were done in these 8 increments of CRs. 8 times we had it until the end of the year, and not enough input about what was actually happening, and certainly not enough transparency. So that's the kind of way in which the CRs actually don't work for us as a budgeting mechanism. We need a thorough and transparent process. And of course, in 14, which was the pinnacle of actually the disruption in Washington, we had a total shutdown, right? which had an unbelievable impact. We're still feeling it nationally, and of course was the sort of the pinnacle of this dysfunction. So this is a very rough graph about, of course, how we want the federal budget to go. We want the president to submit it to Congress. Of course, the work has already started on even the 2016 blueprint, right? The agencies are telling the Office of Management and Budget the kind of vision they're putting forward for their nation. They're listening to constituents, and they're supposed to first pass these things called budget resolutions. That's simply, do we think that the way we're going to make the money and we're going to spend the money makes sense? Does the revenue coming in make sense? Does the spending make sense? And so the House and Senate are supposed to say yes, and they're supposed to issue top-line numbers. And then it's supposed to go to appropriators that actually then think, what's the best interest of our nation? What should we spend this on? And what states should get what money and why? Then they're supposed to reconcile, and then the president is going to sign. Again, we have not had this process. But if we were to, as a nation, hold our Congress and the executive branch to this process, we would have some very, very predictable ways to hang on to this process. As it is, we actually wrote a People's Guide to the Federal Budget, which is a handbook for the president's budget, because in fact we thought even if we don't have a predictable process, there are ways for people to be powerful. And just as a sidebar, the executive office used to put out a primer for our budget. In fact, the Clinton administration was the last administration to do this. It was noble, admirable work, painstaking, and our tax dollars fueled it. But basically, the thought behind it was, this is the people's budget, and therefore there should be a guide for the people to understand these many thousands of lines of budgeting. And in fact, they've stopped it, and I think this is where you and I pick up. Okay, so what is the Bipartisan Budget Act of 2013? The Bipartisan Budget Act was, of course, the act that basically ended the government shutdown. It's actually a very small deal. And by that I mean it was the smallest piece of common ground that our Congress could find. I'm glad they found it. I really am. But in fact, we have to ask them for more, because it's a rather small and limited vision for our nation. It's mostly discretionary focused, meaning it's really going to sit in the pie that we'll show you in a little bit, that's really about this annual spending. You heard that it was worth $85 billion, and what that meant is it was able to repeal some of the sequester's impact in 2014 and 15, and was able to reduce the deficit with the remainder of that money. The majority of the sequester softening was to happen in 14, so when the president puts his budget before the nation in 2015, we're going to see a continued impact of sequestration, both in the defense and the non-defense portions of the discretionary budget. And there were absolutely no new taxes or loophole closes, and it was mostly, the revenue generated was mostly fee-based and having to do with things like pensions and other kinds of waste, fraud, and abuse in action. So it was not at all as global in terms of revenue as it could have been. So the end product, which we're now seeing as our budget for 14, is we're going to have about $1 trillion in discretionary spending. It's a little bit down, but again, not nearly as down from 13 as it would have been. The military will get $605 billion for Department of Defense, nuclear weapons, foreign military aid, foreign military base construction, plus another $85 billion for overseas contingency operations. That's the U.S. wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And then the domestic spending line will get about $491.7 billion. So there remains a discrepancy in our discretionary budget about where we're right now as a nation apportioning these funds. So what's at stake? Let's look at a blueprint for how we're going to make the money. This is the projected tax revenue. Again, President Obama, for this year, and we'll see what he actually projects in the 15 budget, has to say, so how am I going to make this money? And here you can see, again, in actuality, in a pie chart, the way in which you, through your federal income taxes and payroll taxes, are the major stakeholders, with much smaller sums coming from corporate taxes, and then much, much smaller from excise and estate and customs. And this is, for me, a very instructive chart. This is the story of individual income taxes graphed against corporate taxes. And so what we can see in this is the way in which in the 40s, and again this is in the middle of course, World War II, there were actually fairly equally held percentages of overall total revenue, corporations and individuals. And then tax policy has shifted over the years, driving up slightly, but mostly keeping individual income taxes as a body on a fairly slow growth, while at the same time really decreasing the amount of taxes derived from corporations overall. These taxes are, this is both actual tax policy, and it's also the enactment of things called tax expenditures. Tax expenditures, in its classic term, is really spending through the tax code. It's also known as tax breaks or tax loopholes or givebacks. So it's the actual amount that corporations are slated to spend has decreased, but then it's also what they actually spend after they're able to exploit the loopholes that are available to them. So it's actually, for me, a very dramatic picture. It shows where some of the conversation could happen nationally if we were to have an interest in looking at the impact of, for example, raising corporate taxes and then really tackling one or more of the very many tax expenditures. Right now in our nation, National Priorities Project on our site just did a study of this. We scrubbed actually tax expenditures for the first time back to 1974. And in years like 2013, there is $1 trillion in tax expenditures written into the budget. So that in its classic form is $1 trillion not coming back into the US Treasury. And most of that going, a large portion of that going to corporations. And in the top 10, which is about $750 billion, the 1% of Americans get 17% of the benefit. So it's aggregated right now in corporate, the largest corporations and in the wealthiest individuals. Okay, so how are we going to spend the money? Here's a blueprint. So this is the overall budget, and it looks very much like this for many years now. Discretionary spending is roughly a third. Mandatory spending is, of course, around 2/3, and there's the interest on the U.S. debt. This is, of course, these are projected numbers. We'll know more as soon as we can see the full 2014 budget, because it was such an attenuated process, right? These numbers aren't available for us to go back and make these final pie charts, but we will, and you'll see them on our site. We expect actually the interest on the national debt to rise a couple of points, so that's why I've been thinking about it more as an 8%. So mandatory is, of course, as the name sounds, it's mandatory, it's need-based, it's policy-driven, it's slow-moving in terms of being able to transform it. But it is a place where you and I can be powerful, certainly in these long-haul conversations about health care reform and Social Security and Medicare. Discretionary, that's where the fight was. That's the government shutdown. It is also, as its name sounds, at the discretion of the President and Congress. It's the budget that the President will talk about, likely, a lot during the State of the Union tomorrow, and it's the debate that will happen in Congress. It's also the money coming down into Little Rock is largely this discretionary budget. And, wait, actually, go back. So that discretionary budget, that little piece, this is how it blows up when you look at it. So if you're just to take that third and look at it as its own pie chart, this is roughly the percentages. Again, these are estimates. We'll have the full scrub when we see these final 14 numbers. But this is roughly how it plays out right now in terms of the priorities right now with our discretionary dollars, that roughly $1.012 trillion. So military is about 57%. It's not clear to us as if that percentage will shift, and we'll talk a little bit more about why that might shift north a little after we look back. Education at 6%. One of the things that we know is most of education spending, right, happens from the state and local funds. The federal government actually gives very little to education, but what it does is for grants to community colleges, Title I, Head Start, some of those larger programs. international affairs. I know there are people here passionate about international affairs. One of the great myths of our nation is that we could take care of our nation's debt if we simply didn't spend the huge amounts of money that we spend internationally. And of course, I see from the laughter, we all know that is not true, but it is unbelievable. This is an anecdote, but by far the blog post on MPP's site, it's now 2 years old, is how much does the U.S. spend in foreign aid? And their comments there are people saying again and again, oh my goodness, I thought we spent so much more. I thought this would be the deal breaker for us. I thought we were the, on and on, you're at the Clinton School of Public Service. But it's one of the myths that I think we can use to hold up and transform. And then, of course, food and agriculture at 1%. Again, this is an unbelievable conversation to have in our nation, right, where we battle over things like the Farm Bill. And in fact, it is an overall a very small expenditure in terms of the discretionary portion of the budget. So here's a historic line chart about that discretionary budget. So that was the static pie. That was the rough static pie. And here's history. And I go back to 1974 or 5 right there and start it because it tells actually a really interesting story about our nation. It tells a story about our priorities over time. And if you went back at some of these lines where the moments along the lines, the trajectory where the lines cross, you can see really huge moments in our nation. And they tell stories of social movements. They tell stories of, for example, 9/11. They tell stories, for example, in 1981, that was the election of President Ronald Reagan and the beginning of Star Wars. So they tell these moments where the tide turned in our nation. Either something happened in Congress or something happened in our local communities to shift the priorities of our spending. So again, this is on our website, and I think it's useful to us. This is updated to reflect right now to the end of the Bipartisan Budget Act. So you see that we can see that the non-military money is rebounding a little bit and military is coming down a little bit, but there is still that discrepancy between them. So what's at stake? Let's look at this together. This is the story of our taxes and our spending back to 1961. And I want to take you to 2001. And, of course, we're not crazy people to wonder why. In 2011, the nation stopped and said, oh my gosh, let's look at our deficit. Oh my heavens, what's happening, right? Because we had been reducing taxes on the whole since 2001 while we had been spending a great deal, especially on the U.S. wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. So Pentagon spending between 2001 and 2011 went up 48% in real terms, and when adjusted for inflation. So there was an enormous growth. So one of the myths out there is that our discretionary budget is running away. The piece they don't actually talk about a lot is that there was a specific driver of that journey. And at the same time, so that's the gap, of course, that we're facing right now. Right now in the U.S., we have the lowest tax burden in more than half a century. Again, that didn't just happen to us. That's the work of legislation. We can, if we wanted to have that conversation with our elected officials, that's our work to bring that conversation forward. We could also have the conversation about spending priorities and where as a country we want or don't want to spend our tax dollars. So who's winning in currently? So the Pentagon is winning in one way. The overseas contingency operations, Pentagon asked for $79 billion. Congress gave them $85 billion. So they plussed it up. They plussed it up considerably. There's a lot of reasons why that is. Sequester is hard to budget under, and I think that there was some concern on the part of Congress about things like the jobs associated with defense contracts. So it's understandable, but in fact, we still see quite a sum of money going here. And anybody who wanted to see tax reform this summer, when Senator Baucus started to talk about it, we didn't have a win with the Bipartisan Budget Act. We still haven't been able to have a meaningful conversation about tax policy, either in terms of payroll tax caps or federal income taxes. So that's work to be done if you're in those camps. And who's losing? Right now, as you know, I'm sure, we have 1.3 at least million Americans who are long-term unemployed, who are not able to access unemployment right now. Congress was not able to get that done, still isn't able to get that done. One of the interesting things we looked at, one of the things we do at NPP is trade-offs. So we looked at the cost of extending, even for a short bit of time, 3 months, long-term unemployment is about $6.5 billion. And the cost of offshoring corporate tax profits, which is one of the tax expenditures, right? Some corporations don't, that are large enough, get to exploit this thing where they get to have profits off seas and not bring the taxes home. That's $10.5 billion. So that seems like a pretty interesting trade-off to look at for me. Food stamps, of course, are slated for continued cuts. We don't know how that's going to pan out. Federal workers, they've been furloughed when the budget was first sequestered. Certainly during the shutdown there was upheaval in their families, and now there's their pension contribution. The domestic programs, you know, one of the issues that's true in our nation, and again, I think I'm grateful to the Clinton School of Public Service to think about this with, is that already before 2011, before the Budget Control Act, there was more need in our communities than federal or state money could actually meet. So there were more people eligible for service than there were services available in every single sector, and now there's less money. So it's something to think about, and of course, transparency and democracy. So if you care about democracy, what happened with this last budget is a total travesty. And I'm just going to get ready to close, then I'm happy to have your questions. So what can we do? Future generations. Thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you. This gentleman's saying, could I add a category about who's lost future generations? Thank you. I will, actually, next time I'm out on the road, and I'll think of you. Right, our children and grandchildren. So what can we do, right? I have a room full of unbelievably committed people. First thing, March 4th, the budget's going to be a month late, right? OMB said we couldn't do it with all the upheaval. We couldn't get a budget out on time. So President Obama's coming under a huge amount of critique. It's not his fault entirely for this budget being late. As you might remember, last year's budget was later because of the tumult, right? This is not okay. So we have to say, we need to still have a budget resolution. That's that first blueprint where we want to talk about the amount of money we're going to spend and the amount of money we're going to make. We want that. We have to have it. Many times, appropriators will go and think about spending the money that they haven't really been authorized to spend. It's crazy people's business. We have to have it end. So we want a budget resolution that's deliberated in ways that you can have your voice heard with your elected officials. We want the debt ceiling to not become a political football, I believe. I do think we should deal responsibly with annual deficits and aggregate debt. I think we should have a meaningful conversation about that. But I don't think it should hold our Congress up, and I don't think it should be the football that stops us from working together. This is a political maneuver. It's not a matter, I think, of good budgeting. And I really believe that firmly. And we have to actually look at polls. What do people want in terms of earned benefits? What do people want in terms of health care? And we have to actually listen to our neighbors and listen to people across the country, and then hope that we can enact a budget that gets closer to people's views of what's possible and what they need. And finally, this is me personally, and National Priorities Project site has, I can't even tell you the enormous number of resources that we have. Many of them are really state-based, and we're doing actually a fact sheet just at the state level that should be coming out in the next couple of months, and it'll have the most recent data both on indicators like poverty rates, graduation rates, and things like that. I know there are other sources of that, but then we'll actually couple that with the federal spending in your states, at your county level, at your zip code level in some cases, and we hope that that's a service to this great community of Little Rock. And there are other kinds of resources as well, curriculum, and there's an animated cartoon where your paycheck can talk to you, and many, many other things. There are tools for you to play with. You can do your own trade-offs. You can run your own tax receipt. We're actually building an Arkansas tax receipt, so you'll be able to see what the average taxpayer in Arkansas spent on her or his tax return and where that money went. So there'll be other things like this coming, and I do invite you to be in touch with us. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Very good. I've got to say, I just want you to know, in your comments, very good, that in the class that I'm teaching, one of the outside assignments tomorrow night is to watch the State of the Union and then to respond back to me within 20 minutes. Within 20 minutes of their ranking of the State of the Union, what they, yeah. So,
They could tweet it.
oh, no, oh, that's a great idea.
There's a hashtag, pound SOTU. You probably already know this, but pound SOTU will be the hashtag, and already people are tweeting for what they hope President Obama will say, and certainly what, you know, reviews of that would also be, I think, great from Clinton School folks.
It's great. We'll get all over that. All right, now that we got that covered, and then we'll do an exercise on the budget when it gets closer to that, and I'll talk to you about that. Any questions? We got questions. Yes, sir, right back here.
If you had a magic wand and looking at all of this, the process in a more objective way, what kind of tweaks would you recommend to the process?
To the process, to the actual architecture of building a budget. That's a really terrific question. Actually, you know, last night at the wand gathering, there were magic wands out there for the women of wand, so that was pretty lovely. Here's what I would do. This is my fantasy. I'll tell you my total fantasy. I want the people of the United States to build a budget every single year. I want a people's budget to be presented alongside of the president's budget. So that people, and I've thought about with national partners, we're talking to funders about this, but I want people in every single community to be able to put priorities down and then have a bipartisan group, because that'll be really important, to aggregate those priorities and have them put before the nation, and have that be the conversation starter for the budget process. So how far away are we from the will of the greatest diversity of people possible? And then I want actual stopping points along the way. I don't want it to go like a freight train. I want Congress to have to say, okay, we're about to do this budget resolution, and we want to hear about your thoughts about how we're going to make the money and how we're going to spend the money. And we want to, I want there to be deliberative points where we stop. And stop long enough for people who are working 1, 2, 3 jobs, trying to get their kids educated and off to school, to stop and think to yourselves, okay, I can weigh in now, and have, again, those deliberative stopping points. And then I want a report card. I want a report card back to taxpayers. Okay, so you paid this much in, and here's what we did with your money. So those are some of my magic wand fantasies.
Okay. Yes, sir. Right here.
Actually, I have enough questions to last the entire day.
Just
so
do
how
one,
much time do you
please,
have?
so we can
Just
pass
one.
them around.
Okay. I'm a little confused by this concept of the mandatory expenses and the discretionary.
Yeah.
You mentioned that the discretionary budget was $1 trillion. So, and that's only a third of the budget. So the actual budget is $3 trillion.
More than, yeah.
Yeah. So I guess my concern is when I look at your list of the national priorities, health, there are several that are administrative costs only.
Okay, all right, I know where you're going. Okay, hang on, because we're going to go to a fairly technical point. Okay, when you pay your income taxes, they go into a giant pot of money. The pot of money is called the federal fund. And the federal fund is a combination of your income taxes, a much smaller amount of corporate taxes, and then those estate, gift, and excise taxes, and where we borrow. That's all in the federal fund. It pays 2/3 of the nation's bills. So it pays all of discretionary, it pays interest on the debt, and it pays some of mandatory. And the portions, where you saw administrative, the portions in the mandatory budget that your income taxes will fuel, for example, are much smaller amounts of some Social Security administrative costs. And it also, because the rest of Social Security, of course, is paid through by your payroll taxes, which again go into trust fund buckets. And those trust fund buckets are earmarked for earned benefits, like Social Security and Medicare. So that's the confusing point. So you see mandatory being 2/3 of the budget, and yet the federal fund pays for 2/3 of the budget. So there's a way in which they overlap. Does that make sense? Yeah, okay. All right.
All
It is
right.
tricky. It's tricky.
Caroline?
Well, most of us are adults here today, and we're learning about our federal budget and how our federal money is spent and everything. And I wonder if you have any resources. It seems to me that the ABCs of our federal budget ought to be taught much before we get here,
I am with you.
in public schools and everything,
Yeah.
in a way that kids just grow up understanding their government.
I actually couldn't agree with you more. One of our visions for A People's Guide to the Federal Budget, our book, and we took a really minor step toward this last year, is to write curriculum for teachers across the United States. So we've had some modest success, but there is, as you know, the Common Core, the Standard of Common Core, which is the national standard. And here's an opportunity for us. We have to actually, as a nonprofit, I have to seek the funds for this. But there is no history, no social studies curriculum currently really under development. They focused rightfully on math and science and English language arts. So there's a great opportunity. And I'm part of a national conversation of folks wanting to have a significant influence in this. Because I know the same for me. When I was a young woman, I actually had trouble at one point understanding my state legislator from my federal legislator, right? And I wasn't taught it. I didn't really have that reference point. And yet it's critical if we want to raise up a generation. And it has to start really, really early. So we do work with educators across the country. We do webinars, I do teacher trainings, we do things like that. I go into schools and test out. I've been in as young as a 5th grade classroom teaching the book, creating popular education modules, trying to figure out what's the best way to engage young people who I was very moved to see were, fairly savvy because their parents are talking to them about their taxes already. So they had a lot of reference points that were very meaningful. So I couldn't agree with you more. I absolutely think it has to change. It's got to be part of a healthy democracy renewal.
Kay Tyler, right behind you.
Hi, my name is Tyler Pearson. I'm a second-year student here at the Clinton School. At the top of your lecture, you briefly mentioned the importance of also having the conversation about campaign finance reform.
Yeah.
And so I was hoping that you would speak to that a little bit, and that the role that money in politics is having on the budget process
Sure.
today.
Sure. So often at National Priorities Project, what we say is that the only thing stronger than money in politics is an informed, engaged, and a passionate electorate. And so I do believe that the force of the American people can be stronger than money in politics. I think we have that potential if we can really invest in this nation's blueprint. But certainly we have to find a way forward post-Citizen United. I do think that the influence of money complicates the lives of our lawmakers. I feel like it's difficult to do their job. It's a very demanding job to be an elected official. And then on top of that, there's this unbelievable pressure that they feel to get reelected, and then that's becoming more and more expensive. And so they want to serve the nation, and then they have to figure out this unbelievable influx of money. And, it's not, as you know, it's not rocket science to imagine that if a major donor with a particular political agenda is interested in investing in your candidacy, if you want to continue reaping that investment, you may have to be beholden to that agenda. I'm not saying that all are. I think I think our nation is filled with savvy elected officials. But we need to rid them of that problem. And I think the first place to look is money in politics. Often there are many, many studies done. There's a great group called the Friends Committee on National Legislation. It's one of the many, many groups doing these studies, but they're looking at the number of lobbyists that will come into Capitol Hill on any given day. And it's staggering. So it's absolutely something we have to do. I think it's as important as an engaged electorate. They've got to be concurrent pieces of work right now.
At the back, right here, Michael, all the way at the back.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed your talk today. And the question that I have is really focused on finding that common ground. How do we decouple the idea that raising taxes for stimulus effect doesn't necessarily mean having more centralized decision making?
I know, yeah.
Well-
Oh, such a good question. I don't know that I have I don't know that I have an answer worthy of your good question right now. I think that clearly we've lost, here's two things that are coming to mind. One is that we've forgotten that our taxes are an investment, right? It's part of what we get to do in a democracy. We get to pay tax, we get to invest, and then we get to have a say in how that investment is brokered, right? I think we're millions of miles away from that concept, that original founding concept. And so I think if we can bring ourselves a little bit closer to that concept, there won't be such a fear of even talking about taxes. I think we simply need a national conversation about taxes. I don't actually know where it's going to go, but I do think we have to be willing as a nation, our lawmakers have to be willing to look at things like basic tax rates and then these tax expenditures. And the other thing that I think about is that we've lost sight of the federal budget in our midst. So we forget how much of the federal budget is locally administered. In cities like Little Rock. And I was talking to a former mayor of North Little Rock last night, and he was talking to me about the power of the Community Development Block Grant, for example. That's really decentralized money in the hands of a smart mayor can actually make the difference for a small city. So I feel like we have to remember what federal spending can do and how very personal it is. You know, if I'm getting a Pell Grant, I'm getting tax dollars to help my education. That's a decentralized bit of spending. The government's not telling me where to go to school. It's simply saying if I qualify for the maximum Pell Grant, I'll get $5,500 a year, which is too small, right? I mean, thinking about the price of education. But still, I mean, it's something. And for some students, it can be the difference between attending college or not. So I feel like we have to think about investment and also think about the ways in which it's not just these monolith programs run amok. In Washington, D.C., it's you and me, it's small cities, it's states, beautiful states like Arkansas, who are administering those dollars, our common investment. That's what I think.
I know we have a lot more questions
I'm
for
sorry.
Joe, and so I think, you know, please come visit with her after the program to ask your questions. I do want to say that we're very pleased to have the former mayor of Little Rock here, Mayor Jim Daley. Let's give Mayor Daley a round of applause.
Oh.